Daniel Whitmore stood on the balcony of the lavish Whitmore estate, his sharp blue eyes scanning the glittering party below. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and designer perfume. A symphony of wealth and excess. He thrived in this world, where power was measured in assets and influence. Nothing fazed him, at least. Nothing ever had. But tonight, something was different. A lingering restlessness tugged at the edges of his mind, though he pushed it aside like an unwelcome guest. Still convinced money can buy anything? A voice cut through the hum of conversation. Daniel turned his head slightly and smirked at the man who approached. Michael Sinclair, his oldest friend and, at times, his most irritating rival. Michael held a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid lazily as he leaned against the railing beside Daniel. Daniel exhaled, his smirk unwavering. Because it can. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. You always say that, but I wonder, do you really believe it? Or do you just like hearing yourself talk? Daniel raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Is this going somewhere? Or are you just here to bore me? Michael's grin widened as he pointed toward the street below. There. Daniel followed his gaze and spotted her immediately. A woman sat on the cold pavement, barely illuminated by the streetlights. Her head was bowed, her shoulders hunched against the autumn chill. A worn-out hoodie swallowed her thin frame, and her hands clutched a piece of cardboard with the desperate scrawl, "Anything helps." A plastic cup sat beside her, a few crumpled bills and loose change rattling inside as pedestrians tossed in coins without meeting her eyes. A beggar. Daniel felt nothing as he looked at her, no pity, no curiosity. She was just another forgotten soul in a city that devoured the weak. He had walked past thousands like her without a second thought. Michael, however, was watching him with something bordering on amusement. "I bet you $2 million, he said, voice laced with challenge, "that you can't turn that woman into a high society lady and stay married to her for 3 months. Daniel snorted. "That's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard." "Then walk away," Michael taunted, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Admit that there's something even you can't buy." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. A dare. A trap. Michael wanted to see if there was a limit to his arrogance. A line he wouldn't cross. And that was exactly why he wouldn't walk away. $2 million was nothing to him, it was the principle. He prided himself on never losing, never backing down from a challenge. And above all, he despised the idea that there was something beyond his control. His eyes flickered back to the woman on the street. He saw nothing but an experiment. A gamble he was certain he could win. His smirk returned. "You're on." Michael's laughter was low and satisfied as he raised his glass. "This should be entertaining." Daniel finished his champagne in one smooth gulp, set the glass down, and turned toward the exit. Within minutes, he was on the sidewalk, standing just a few steps away from the woman. Up close, she was even smaller than she'd seemed from above. Her tangled brown hair barely reached her shoulders, and her worn-out sneakers had holes in them. She didn't look up when he approached. She had likely learned that men in suits never stopped for people like her. "Excuse me," he said. Her head snapped up, blue eyes locking onto his with a mix of wariness and exhaustion. For a brief moment, something flickered in her expression, an unspoken question. "Are you here to help or to mock me?" "What do you want?" she asked, her voice rough, as though she hadn't spoken in hours. Daniel tilted his head slightly, intrigued by the faint defiance in her tone. Most beggars cowered, grateful for any attention. She, however, looked at him like she was prepared for disappointment. He smiled, though it was more out of amusement than kindness. "I have a proposition for you." She narrowed her eyes. "A proposition?" "Yes." He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, unfazed by the grime-streaked pavement beneath him. "You look like you could use a fresh start." Her lips pressed into a thin line, skepticism written all over her face. "No offense, but I don't think rich guys in tuxedos give out fresh starts for free." Daniel chuckled. He liked her sharpness. It made this more interesting. "Not for free. No, it's an arrangement, a contract." She scoffed. "Figures. You marry me for 3 months." He continued, voice smooth, confident. "In return, I'll provide food, clothes, shelter, and at the end of it, you'll walk away with $1 million. She went still. For the first time, there was genuine shock in her expression. 1,000 unspoken thoughts flashed across her face: confusion, Disbelief. Calculation. He had seen that look before. People at rock bottom always hesitated when presented with an opportunity too good to be true. Her fingers tightened around her cardboard sign. Why me? Daniel's smirk didn't waver. Because you're here. Her jaw clenched. His answer clearly irritated her. Though she didn't immediately reject him. She was weighing the offer. Considering the risk against the reward. Seconds passed like hours before she finally whispered. This isn't some kind of scam? He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Bring the car. Moments later, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside them, its headlights casting a soft glow on the pavement. The driver, dressed in a crisp black suit, stepped out and opened the back door without a word. Daniel stood, watching her reaction. She stared at the car, then at him, her eyes filled with doubt and reluctant hope. I don't have all night, he said coolly. Do you want to keep sitting in the cold? Or do you want to hear the rest of the deal somewhere more comfortable? The woman hesitated only a second longer before she stood on shaky legs. My name is Evelyn, she muttered. Daniel smiled. Welcome to your new life, Evelyn. She climbed into the car. And he followed, already strategizing the next steps in his mind. This was a game, a bet, one he was certain he would win. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that this game would change him forever. The silence inside the sleek black sedan was deafening. Evelyn sat stiffly against the smooth leather seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to create a barrier between her and the impossibility of her current situation. The world outside the tinted windows blurred past in streaks of neon and shadows. But she barely noticed. She wasn't even sure she was breathing properly. Minutes ago, she had been on the street, her body aching from exhaustion, the cold seeping into her bones like a parasite she could never shake. She had been nothing, invisible to the world, and now she was sitting next to a man who had offered her a deal that sounded like something out of a cruel joke. Marry him, for 3 months, and in return, she would have food, clothes, a roof over her head, and $1 million. Her stomach twisted. She turned her head slightly, studying him in the dim interior of the car. Daniel Whitmore sat next to her with effortless confidence, one hand casually resting against his chin as he scrolled through his phone with the other. Completely unaffected by the weight of what had just happened. She hated that, hated how composed he was. Hated that to him, this was nothing. But what choice did she have? Evelyn had learned long ago that life was not kind to women like her. There were no fairy tale endings, no miraculous rescues. She had spent the last 2 years being ignored, passed over, forgotten. The world had chewed her up, spit her out, and left her gasping for air on the cold concrete of a city that never stopped moving. And now, a man with ice in his veins and money in his pockets was offering her a way out. Was it worth the price? Her hands curled into fists. She would find out. Tilda. The car came to a slow, smooth stop in front of an elegant hotel, its towering glass walls reflecting the city's skyline like a portal to another world. Evelyn hesitated before stepping out, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had expected Daniel to take her somewhere unfamiliar, someplace where she would be hidden away until she had been sufficiently remade into whatever version of a wife he wanted. Instead, he had brought her to the kind of place she had once only seen in passing, places where people like him belonged. And people like her didn't even exist. The doorman greeted Daniel with a polite nod, his gaze barely flickering to Evelyn. It wasn't judgmental or cruel, just indifferent. As if she were already part of the scenery. She followed Daniel into the elevator, trying not to let her discomfort show. Your room is on the top floor, he said coolly, not looking at her as he pressed the button. You'll stay here tonight. In the morning, we'll go over the contract and finalize the arrangements. Evelyn swallowed hard. And if I change my mind? Daniel turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then you go back to the street. The cold certainty in his voice made her stomach drop. Of course, he wouldn't beg her to stay. He wouldn't even try to convince her. She was a business deal. Nothing more. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a private penthouse that stretched out like a dream she had once had as a child. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in golden light, and a massive chandelier cast soft shadows against marble floors. The air smelled of fresh linen, expensive cologne, and something faintly floral, as if someone had anticipated her arrival and had tried to make the space less intimidating. But it was intimidating. Because this wasn't her world. Not yet. Daniel stepped inside and gestured toward a door on the left. Your bedroom is through there. Clothes will be delivered in the morning. Rest while you can. She crossed her arms, not moving. And you? He gave her a lazy smirk. I have my own place. The reminder that he had no intention of sharing a space with her sent a strange wave of relief through her. It also made her wonder why this arrangement mattered to him at all. Before she could ask, he turned and walked toward the elevator. He didn't say goodnight, didn't ask if she needed anything. He simply left. And for the first time in what felt like years, Evelyn was alone in a place that was warm. Safe. For tonight, at least. Tilda. The morning arrived with an unfamiliar luxury, silence. No shouting. No honking cars. No cold wind biting at her exposed skin. Just soft sheets, a thick duvet, and the realization that, for the first time in forever, she had actually slept through the night. A knock at the door made her jolt upright. She wasn't used to this. To people knocking. To anyone acknowledging her presence. She swallowed hard before calling out. Yes? A voice, female, polite, responded. Room service. Ma'am, Mr. Whitmore asked us to bring breakfast. Evelyn hesitated before forcing herself to stand. When she opened the door, a hotel employee pushed in a gleaming cart laden with food. Fresh fruit, eggs, toast, coffee. The scent made her mouth water. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten something that wasn't scavenged or handed to her with barely concealed disgust. She sat hesitantly, picking up a fork as if it might disappear if she touched it. A lifetime ago, she had eaten like this. Before everything had fallen apart. Before she had lost everything. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to take a bite. And then another. And another. By the time she realized what she was doing, her plate was empty. She exhaled slowly, wiping her mouth with a napkin, trying to ignore the sudden wave of emotion rising in her chest. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in this place. Not over food. Another knock at the door. This time, she didn't hesitate. She opened it, half expecting another hotel worker. But instead, Daniel stood there, dressed in his usual crisp suit, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Are you ready? He asked. For what? Signing away the next 3 months of her life? Becoming something she wasn't? Trading one kind of survival for another? No, she wasn't ready. But she nodded anyway. Daniel stepped inside, placing the folder on the table. He opened it with practiced ease, flipping through pages of neatly typed clauses, all outlining the rules of their arrangement. Evelyn glanced at the contract, her heart pounding in her chest. There it was, her name, next to his, bound together by legal formalities. Not love, not even respect. Read it, Daniel said, his voice impassive. Make sure you understand everything. She skimmed through the words, though she already knew what they meant. No emotional involvement, no real intimacy. 3 months, and then she would be free. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. She paused, for just a moment. Then she signed. Daniel watched her with cool detachment, then took the folder, slipping it back under his arm. Be ready by noon, he said. For what? Our wedding. Evelyn inhaled sharply. So soon? Daniel's gaze was unreadable. This isn't about romance, Evelyn. It's business. Business. Of course. She nodded slowly, though her stomach was twisting into impossible knots. Daniel turned to leave, but this time, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, his tone unreadable. I always honor my contracts. The door shut behind him, and Evelyn sat there, staring at the papers that had just sealed her fate. In a few hours, she would become Mrs. Whitmore. For 3 months. And then? She had no idea. But she had made her choice. Now, she would have to survive it. Evelyn Whitmore. The name sounded foreign to her, as though it belonged to someone else. And in many ways, it did. Yesterday, she had been Evelyn Clark, the woman no one saw. The woman whose presence was a mere inconvenience on the streets of New York. Today, she was stepping out of a courthouse, legally bound to a man who didn't love her, who barely saw her as more than a challenge to be won. A man who had paid for her existence like he was buying a rare piece of art to mold into whatever shape he saw fit. Her wedding band was a cold weight on her finger, a stark reminder that she was no longer free. Not for the next 3 months. As she slid into the backseat of Daniel's car, The reality of what she had done settled deep in her bones. She had sold herself, not in the way some desperate women on the streets were forced to, but in a far more insidious way. She had sold her dignity, her autonomy, her future, all in the name of survival. And Daniel? He was as detached as ever, scrolling through his phone as if the vows they had exchanged minutes ago were nothing more than a business transaction. "Your lessons start tomorrow," he said without looking up. Evelyn turned her head sharply, her jaw tightening. "Lessons?" Daniel finally met her gaze, his expression as impassive as ever. "You'll need to learn how to present yourself properly if you're going to pass as my wife." There was something in his tone that made her stomach twist. Not cruel, exactly, but indifferent. He didn't care about her, only the outcome of this absurd bet. "And if I don't?" she challenged. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then you'll be failing at the only thing I'm paying you for." Evelyn bit the inside of her cheek to keep from snapping back. She had agreed to this. She had signed the contract. And now, she had to see it through. The next morning, she woke up in a room so large it felt like an entire apartment. The bed was impossibly soft, the sheets expensive, the air thick with the scent of fresh flowers. But she barely had time to appreciate any of it before the first wave of her so-called transformation began. It started with clothes. A team of stylists and designers flooded into her room, each with an armful of garments so expensive that just touching them made her hands feel dirty. "She has good bone structure," one of them murmured as they lifted her chin. "A little refinement, and she'll pass for high society in no time." Evelyn flinched. Pass? As if she were nothing more than an object, a thing to be altered and displayed. They measured her, pulled at her hair, whispered about how much work would be needed to turn her into a proper Mrs. Whitmore. And through it all, Daniel watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Don't fight it," he said when their eyes met. "It'll be easier that way." Easy. As if anything about this was easy. Still, she endured it. The fittings, the shoes that pinched, the endless parade of dresses that made her feel like she was drowning in silk and lace. She endured the etiquette lessons, hours spent learning which fork to use, how to sit without slouching, how to smile without showing too much emotion. She endured the hours with the posture coach, walking back and forth in the mirrored room as a woman with a clipped British accent criticized every movement she made. "You look uncomfortable in your own skin." The woman tsked. "That won't do at all." Evelyn wanted to scream. Of course she was uncomfortable. She was a homeless woman wearing a borrowed life. But she didn't scream. She gritted her teeth and kept moving. Because she had already lost too much to let them see her break. Days turned into weeks. Evelyn became a ghost in Daniel's mansion, a woman constantly watched, constantly molded, but never truly acknowledged. Daniel kept his distance, appearing only when necessary, never lingering for longer than needed. Their dinners were silent affairs. Him at one end of the impossibly long dining table, her at the other. At first, she had tried to engage him in conversation, but every attempt was met with a half-hearted response or a disinterested nod. So, she stopped trying, until one night, when she couldn't take the silence anymore. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the heavy quiet. Daniel glanced up from his glass of whiskey, his brow arching slightly. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured around them. "The bet, the transformation, all of it. What do you get out of it?" For the first time, something flickered behind his gaze. Something almost unreadable. And then, just like that, it was gone. "I don't lose bets," he said simply. Evelyn's stomach dropped. That was all she was to him. A bet. A challenge. Not a person. She set her fork down carefully, pushing her plate away. "Good night, Daniel," she said, rising to her feet. She didn't look back as she left the dining room. She didn't want to see whatever expression he might, or might not, have worn. It wasn't until the night of the charity gala that Evelyn finally understood just how much she had changed. She had been prepared for weeks for this moment. Hair styled to perfection, makeup soft and elegant. The dress Daniel had chosen for her fit like a second skin, deep blue, flowing, sophisticated. When she stepped out of the dressing room, she expected to feel ridiculous. Instead, she felt powerful. For the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, she felt like she had control over something. She wasn't sure if she liked it. Daniel stood waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase, dressed in his usual tailored perfection. For a moment, he just looked at her. Not with indifference, not with calculation, with something else entirely, something she couldn't name. You look, he hesitated, acceptable. Evelyn rolled her eyes, forcing down the strange warmth in her chest. You're terrible at compliments. You know that? A small smirk tugged at his lips. But he didn't respond. Instead, he offered his arm. She hesitated. And then, with a deep breath, she took it. As they stepped into the waiting car, Evelyn told herself this was just another lesson. Another performance. Nothing more. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Not just in the way she walked. Not just in the way people looked at her now. But in the way Daniel Whitmore was starting to look at her. And that terrified her more than anything else. Evelyn Whitmore had learned to survive disappointment. It had followed her like a shadow for most of her life, creeping into every corner of her existence. She had been let down by the system that should have protected her. Abandoned by people who claimed to care. Forgotten by a world that never looked twice at women like her. So, why did it still hurt? Why, after everything she had been through, did it feel like she was shattering all over again? Her hands trembled as she clutched the pages of the printed conversation in front of her. The words swam in her vision, the ink staining her fingertips like the scars she carried from the streets. Michael. So, has she agreed? Daniel. Yes, it's only a matter of time before I win. A bet. A game. That's all she had ever been to him. Evelyn's throat tightened, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. An angry roar that drowned out every rational thought. She had suspected it from the beginning. She knew Daniel wasn't the type of man to make selfless offers. But seeing it written, cold and undeniable, sent a dagger straight through her chest. A sound escaped her, something between a bitter laugh and a sob. She should have run when she had the chance. She should have known better. Instead, she had let herself believe, even for a moment, that she was more than just a temporary inconvenience in his perfect little world. Footsteps. Her head snapped up as the door to the office swung open. Daniel entered, his phone in hand, brows furrowed in concentration, until he saw her. His entire body went rigid. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, his gaze flickered to the papers in her hands. Evelyn saw it. The moment realization dawned in his eyes. She tightened her grip, her knuckles turning white. Is this how you see me? She whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Just a bet? Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Evelyn, answer me, she snapped, her voice raw with betrayal. Daniel took a step forward, but she stepped back, clutching the papers like they were the last thing tethering her to reality. It's not as simple as you think, he said, his voice careful. A bitter laugh tore from her throat. Not as simple? You bought me, Daniel. You paraded me around like some prize you could claim. And the whole time, her breath hitched. The whole time, you were just waiting to win. His jaw clenched. It started that way. Yes. Evelyn sucked in a sharp breath, her body going ice cold. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation made it worse. It told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't apologizing, because to him, there was nothing to apologize for. Her heart twisted painfully. This wasn't heartbreak. It was something worse. It was humiliation. She had spent weeks, letting herself believe she had some control over this arrangement. That maybe, just maybe, she had managed to carve out some dignity in the chaos. But she had been a fool. A fool for thinking she could ever be anything more than a pawn in his game. Evelyn let the papers slip from her fingers, fluttering to the ground like fallen leaves. I can't stay here, she whispered. Daniel's expression darkened. What? She turned sharply, heading for the door. But before she could take another step, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. Evelyn, he said, his voice tight, controlled. You don't have to do this. She yanked her arm free. I never had a choice. Did I? Daniel's face hardened, his mask of indifference slipping back into place. You do now, he said quietly. Evelyn looked up at him, searching his face for something, anything, that could make this hurt less. But there was nothing, just the man who had turned her life into a game. She turned and walked out, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Tilda. The night air was cold, biting at her skin as she stumbled through the mansion grounds. She needed to leave. She needed to disappear before he had a chance to stop her. Her mind screamed at her to run faster. But her body was weak, her muscles trembling from exhaustion and heartbreak. Still, she kept going. Through the garden, past the gate, onto the darkened street. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each step heavier than the last. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. All she knew was that she had to get away. Tilda. She had been walking for hours when the cold finally caught up to her. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank onto a bench in a quiet, empty park. Her entire body ached, but the pain in her chest was worse. She pressed her hands to her face, sucking in a shaky breath. Tears slipped past her defenses, carving silent tracks down her cheeks. She had nothing. No home, no safety, no future. She was back to where she started. And this time, she wasn't sure she had the strength to survive it. Tilda. Back at the mansion, Daniel stood in the doorway of her empty room. A single lamp cast a dim glow, illuminating the untouched bed, the abandoned dresses hanging in the closet, the small things she had begun to make her own. She was gone. The realization settled heavily in his chest, a weight he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore felt helpless, and he hated it. He had always been in control, always dictated how things would unfold. But not this time, not with her. A voice echoed in his head, one he had spent his entire life ignoring. You're going to lose her. His jaw tightened. No, not like this. Not when he had just begun to understand that she was never the bet. She was the prize he never deserved. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to fix it. Tilda. Do you think Evelyn should forgive Daniel? Or is his betrayal unforgivable? Tell us in the comments below. If you believe Evelyn deserves happiness, hit the like button to support her journey. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this. Because love isn't about games. It's about choices. And sometimes, the hardest choice is walking away. Evelyn didn't remember falling asleep. One moment, she was sitting on the cold metal bench, her body aching, her mind spinning with betrayal. The next, she was waking to the first rays of morning light filtering through the trees, casting long golden shadows across the quiet park. For a second, she forgot where she was. Then, the memories slammed into her like a tidal wave. The contract, the bet, Daniel. Her stomach twisted, and she curled in on herself, wrapping her arms around her legs to fight off the morning chill. Her clothes, once pristine, were now wrinkled. Her hair was tangled from the night air. She had spent weeks being transformed into someone new, only to find herself right back where she started, alone, lost, and unwanted. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't cry. Not for him. Not for the man who had toyed with her life like it was just another business deal. Not for the man who had let her walk away without a fight. Tilda. She didn't know how long she sat there. But eventually, the sound of footsteps made her lift her head. The world around her was starting to wake. Joggers passed by, too wrapped up in their music to notice the broken woman sitting on the bench. A mother walked by, pushing a stroller, her laughter soft as she whispered to the baby inside. Evelyn's fingers curled into her sleeves. She had nothing, nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She was back to being invisible. Just another forgotten face in a city that never stopped moving. But before she could sink into that hopelessness, a shadow fell over her. She knew before she even looked up. She felt him. Daniel. Her entire body went rigid. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze. He was standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his suit still perfectly pressed despite the early hour. But his eyes, they weren't cold, they weren't indifferent. For the first time, Daniel Whitmore looked human, and he looked wrecked. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing herself to sit up straighter, to push down the storm of emotions rising in her chest. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I came to find you," he said simply. Evelyn scoffed. "Why, afraid of losing your bet?" His jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face, guilt, regret, something deeper. "I cancelled the bet," he said quietly. "The money's gone. Michael won't see a cent of it." Evelyn blinked, Of all the things she had expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. But she refused to let it affect her. You think that changes anything? She asked. Her voice sharper now, cutting through the space between them. You think I care about the money? No, he admitted. But I thought you should know. She shook her head, pushing herself to her feet. She hated this. She hated the way he was looking at her. Like she was something precious. Something he was afraid to break. He had already broken her. And now, here he was, standing in front of her like he expected her to just forget. I don't understand you, she said, crossing her arms over her chest, as if that could protect her from the weight of his presence. You spent weeks treating me like a project, like a pawn in some ridiculous game. And now, suddenly, you're what? Sorry? Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then, he said something that nearly knocked the air from her lungs. I was wrong. Evelyn froze. Daniel Whitmore never admitted to being wrong. Never. She searched his face, waiting for the lie, waiting for the arrogance, waiting for the man she had come to despise. But he wasn't there. Instead, there was only a man who looked like he was fighting a war inside himself. A man who, for the first time, wasn't in control. I was wrong about the bet, he continued, his voice rough now, like the words were being torn from him. I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about myself. Evelyn clenched her fists. You don't get to do this, she said, shaking her head. You don't get to stand here and act like this means something. His eyes darkened. It does mean something. No, she snapped. It doesn't, because if it did, you never would have made the bet in the first place. If it did, you never would have looked at me like I was just, her voice broke. She sucked in a sharp breath. Like I was just a problem you needed to fix. Daniel stepped forward, his hands still in his pockets, as if he knew she would run if he moved too fast. You're not a problem, Evelyn, he said. She let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because that's exactly how you treated me. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening again. I know. Silence stretched between them. A thick, unbearable silence. Evelyn felt her resolve slipping, felt the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. She had to get out of here. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, his voice stopped her. I miss you. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned back. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those damn eyes, held something raw, something real. Evelyn's heart ached. Don't say that, she whispered. Don't you dare say that. He swallowed hard. It's the truth. She shook her head. You don't get to miss me. You don't get to want me. You don't get to have me. Daniel. She saw it then, the flicker of pain in his gaze. The way his shoulders tensed. The way his breath hitched just slightly. She had hurt him, and that terrified her, because hurting him meant she still cared. And she couldn't. She wouldn't. Evelyn sucked in a shaky breath and straightened her spine. This is over, she said, her voice steady now. You made your choice, and I made mine. Daniel didn't move, didn't argue, didn't beg. He just stood there, watching her, his hands clenched at his sides. And for a moment, she thought he would let her go. But then, he whispered, I love you. The words stopped her in her tracks. She turned, her chest tightening, her entire body frozen. She waited for him to take it back, to say it was just another manipulation. But he didn't. He just stood there, his eyes burning into hers, waiting. And for the first time, Evelyn didn't know what to do. She had spent her whole life running. And now, for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. Evelyn hadn't planned on ever seeing Daniel again. Not after the betrayal. Not after everything he had done. But life had a cruel sense of humor. It had been 2 weeks since she had walked away. 2 weeks since she had stood in that cold park, watching the only man who had ever truly seen her admit he had been wrong. 2 weeks since he had told her he loved her. And now, she was standing face to face with the one person who could destroy whatever was left of her fragile peace. Kimberly Whitmore, Daniel's mother. She was as formidable as Evelyn had imagined, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. Her hair pinned back in an elegant twist, every inch of her exuding wealth and power. But her eyes were the sharpest weapon of all. Cold, calculating, hungry for destruction. Evelyn tightened her grip on the coffee cup in her hands, willing herself to stay calm. I assume you know who I am, Kimberly said, her voice smooth and sharp, like a blade sliding between ribs. Evelyn exhaled slowly. You're Daniel's mother. Kimberly smiled, though it held no warmth. Good, she said, taking the seat across from her. Then we can skip the introductions and get straight to the point. Evelyn braced herself. I know everything, Kimberly continued, folding her hands neatly on the table. About the bet, about the arrangement, about your little act. Evelyn's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. Is that so? She said, keeping her voice steady. Kimberly's lips curled. You're smart. That's good. But let's not pretend you're something you're not. Dear, you were nothing before my son plucked you off the street. You had nothing. Evelyn's fingers clenched around her cup. She had heard worse before. Had been called worse. But coming from Kimberly Whitmore? From a woman who had never known hunger, or fear, or desperation? It made her blood boil. And now, Kimberly continued, tilting her head slightly, you think you can just walk away and pretend none of this ever happened? How naive. Evelyn forced a breath through her nose. She had dealt with rich people before. They all thought money made them untouchable. That it made her disposable. She lifted her chin. I didn't think I could walk away. I did walk away. Kimberly's smile faded. For a brief moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Annoyance. Frustration. Amusement. Evelyn wasn't sure which. But it didn't matter. Because whatever Kimberly had come here for, she wasn't going to get it. You misunderstand me, Kimberly said, leaning in slightly. I don't care what you do. I don't care where you go. But my son? He has a future. A legacy. And you? You don't fit into it. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She should have expected this. Of course Daniel's mother wouldn't let this go. Of course she would want Evelyn gone. I already left, she said, forcing the words out past the lump in her throat. Daniel has nothing to do with me anymore. Kimberly's smirk returned. And yet, here I am. Evelyn's hands went cold. Something about the way she said it, like she knew something Evelyn didn't, made her pulse spike. Kimberly pulled a folded document from her purse and placed it on the table. Sign this, she said. Evelyn hesitated before reaching for it. Her eyes scanned the words, her breath catching in her chest. A non-disclosure agreement. It wasn't just about keeping quiet about the bet. It was about disappearing. It was about erasing herself from Daniel's life entirely. No contact, no communication, no second chances. Forever. Evelyn's throat went dry. She looked up, meeting Kimberly's unrelenting gaze. You think you can buy me off? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kimberly's expression didn't change. Everyone has a price. Evelyn let out a slow breath. Of course she did. Of course the Whitmores thought money could fix everything. That money could make her vanish. But they were wrong. Because Evelyn wasn't that woman anymore. She had been pushed down too many times. Had clawed her way back from the darkness. She had survived things Kimberly Whitmore couldn't even imagine. And she wasn't going to let some overprivileged socialite tell her what she was worth. Evelyn slid the paper back across the table. No. Kimberly blinked. Excuse me? Evelyn met her gaze, steady and unflinching. No, she repeated. I won't sign it. Kimberly's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't think you understand what's at stake, she said coolly. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low and unshaken. No, you don't understand. She folded her arms. I don't want Daniel's money. I don't want his legacy. And I sure as hell don't want your approval. Kimberly's nostrils flared, but she didn't speak. For the first time, she looked unsure, like she hadn't expected resistance. Like she hadn't expected Evelyn to fight back. Evelyn took a deep breath. Standing from the table, this conversation is over, she said, and if Daniel wants me out of his life, he can tell me himself. She turned on her heel, walking away without looking back. Her heart pounded with every step. But she kept walking, because she wasn't running anymore. She wasn't the scared girl from the streets. She wasn't the project Daniel had tried to fix. She was Evelyn Whitmore, and she decided her own worth. But as she walked away, she had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. That Kimberly Whitmore wasn't the type to lose. And that Daniel might not even know what his mother had done. Evelyn wasn't sure what had led her here. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the gnawing feeling in her gut that told her this fight wasn't over. Either way, she found herself standing outside the towering glass building that bore the name Whitmore Enterprises. Daniel's world. A world she had walked away from. A world she had no place in. And yet, here she was. She gripped the strap of her bag tightly, steadying her breath before stepping through the doors. The receptionist looked up. eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice polite but laced with curiosity. "Mr. Whitmore is in a meeting. But I can let him know." "No," Evelyn interrupted, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "I'll wait." The receptionist hesitated before nodding, gesturing toward the sleek leather chairs in the waiting area. Evelyn sat, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what she was going to say. Only that she needed to say it. "Tilda." The moment Daniel stepped into the lobby, their eyes locked. For a second, he froze, like he wasn't sure if she was real. Then, he moved. Quick, determined strides. Like a man who had been searching for something he wasn't sure he would ever find. "Evelyn." Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. But she held her ground. "Your mother came to see me," she said, voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Daniel's expression darkened instantly. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice low. Evelyn reached into her bag, pulling out the folded contract Kimberly had handed her. "She wants me to disappear," she said, tossing it onto the desk beside them. "Completely. No contact. No trace. Just, gone." Daniel's jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might crack. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. And then, without a word, he picked up the contract, ripped it in half, and let the pieces flutter to the ground. Evelyn inhaled sharply. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. His shoulders tense. "I should have known," he muttered. "I should have." "You didn't know," Evelyn interrupted softly. His gaze snapped back to hers. Something passed between them. Something raw. Something unspoken. And Evelyn knew. This wasn't just about Kimberly. This was about them. Daniel took a step closer. His voice lower now. "Evelyn, I don't," she whispered. His expression flickered, confusion, hesitation. But she wasn't done. "You don't get to say the right things now," she said, blinking away the sting in her eyes. "You don't get to fix this with one grand gesture." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I know," he admitted, "but I still have to try." Her heart clenched. She wanted to believe him. But believing meant risking. And she wasn't sure she could survive being broken again. So, she took a slow, steady breath, and made her choice. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly, "but I do know that I don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then let me prove it to you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not with words, with actions." Evelyn hesitated. But then, she nodded. A small nod. A hesitant nod. A maybe. But a maybe was better than nothing. "Tilda." The next few weeks were different. Daniel didn't push, didn't demand. He simply showed up. In the little ways. In the way he made sure she had everything she needed. In the way he listened when she spoke. Truly listened, without trying to control the conversation. In the way he changed, not just for her, but for himself. And slowly, ever so slowly, Evelyn felt the walls she had built begin to crack. She wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it was the night he showed up at the community shelter she had started volunteering at. Maybe it was the way he quietly donated to the programs she cared about, not under his name. Not as some grand statement, but simply because he knew they mattered to her. Maybe it was the night he brought her a cup of coffee. Just the way she liked it. And sat beside her on the steps of her tiny apartment building. Saying nothing, just being there. Or maybe it was the night he told her about his mother. Really told her. How he had spent his whole life trying to be what she wanted. How he had let that need for approval dictate every choice he made. How he had been so afraid of failing that he had never once stopped to ask himself who he really wanted to be. And how, for the first time, he wanted to be different. For himself. For her. Tilda. The night air was cool as Evelyn stood outside the mansion. Her fingers traced the edge of the silver butterfly pendant around her neck, the one Daniel had given her weeks ago. A symbol of change, of transformation, of the impossible becoming possible. She took a deep breath. And knocked. The door swung open almost instantly. As if he had been waiting. Daniel stared at her, something unreadable in his gaze. Evelyn swallowed. Her heart raced. And then, finally, she spoke. "I'm ready to try." Daniel's breath caught. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. And then, slowly, he reached for her. Not pulling. Not demanding. Just waiting. And for the first time, she reached back. Do you think Evelyn made the right choice? Should she trust Daniel again? Tell us in the comments. If you believe in second chances, hit like to support Evelyn's journey. Subscribe for more emotional stories, because love isn't about perfection. It's about the fight to be better. Because some love stories aren't about fairy tale endings. Some are about the choice to begin again. Evelyn never imagined she'd be standing here. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the betrayal. Not after the pain. Not after she had walked away. But here she was, standing in front of a man who had once seen her as nothing more than a bet. A man who had hurt her. A man who had changed. And she had changed too. The past didn't vanish overnight. Scars didn't fade just because someone apologized. But standing here, with Daniel's steady gaze locked onto hers, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had spent so much of her life waiting for the next disaster. The next betrayal. The next moment when everything would crumble beneath her feet. But this moment? This moment wasn't crumbling. It was standing firm. Because she was standing firm. Because they were. Daniel had fought for her. Not with grand gestures. Not with expensive gifts or hollow words. But with time. With patience. With quiet, consistent change. And slowly, piece by piece, she had let him back in. Not because she was weak. But because she was strong enough to believe in something again. To believe in him. The days turned into weeks. Then into months. And Evelyn found herself learning what love really was. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was waking up to Daniel making her coffee just the way she liked it. Even though he still insisted his way was better. It was working together on their charity projects. Seeing the way his eyes softened when she spoke about her ideas. Knowing he genuinely cared. It was sitting in comfortable silence. Watching the rain fall against the window. Not needing to fill the space with words. It was arguing, because they still argued, but knowing neither of them would walk away this time. It was Daniel learning to let go of control. And Evelyn learning to let someone in. It was trust. Real. Fragile. Earned trust. One morning, Evelyn stood by the window. Watching the sun rise over the city. Daniel walked up behind her. His arms wrapping around her waist. His chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. She smiled softly. "Everything," she admitted. He pressed a kiss to her temple. His warmth seeping into her. "I have something for you," he said, pulling back slightly. Evelyn turned, watching as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her heart stilled. Not from fear. Not from uncertainty. But from knowing. Because she knew what this was. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what it meant. Daniel opened the box, revealing a delicate ring, simple, beautiful, right. No pressure, no expectations, just a question, just him. "Evelyn Clark Whitmore," he said, voice steady but full of emotion. "Will you marry me? For real this time. No contracts, no bets, just us." Tears welled in her eyes. She let out a shaky breath. And she smiled. "Yes," she whispered. The relief on Daniel's face was instant. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because to him, she was. The wedding was small, just a few close friends. No extravagance, no show, no performance, just love. Daniel looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. And when he spoke his vows, his voice raw with emotion, she knew. This was real. This was theirs. Years passed. Their love deepened, strengthened. Evelyn continued working with shelters, turning her pain into purpose, helping people like her, people who had once been forgotten. Daniel, once consumed by power and status, found fulfillment in something greater, something real. Together, they built a life they never could have imagined. A life not built on money, not on bets, but on love. Real, messy, imperfect love. One day, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset, Evelyn reached for Daniel's hand. He turned to her, his brow lifting slightly. She took a deep breath, placing his hand over her stomach. His eyes widened. Shock. Then realization. Then, pure, unfiltered joy. "We're having a baby?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Evelyn nodded, her own tears falling. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it was as if he was afraid to let go. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. And Evelyn, for the first time in her life, knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Evelyn Whitmore had once believed that love was a luxury meant for other people. People who had never been abandoned. People who had never known what it felt like to be invisible. People who had never been a bet. But as she sat on the front porch of their home, watching the golden hues of sunset paint the sky, she realized something. Love wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about grand gestures or extravagant gifts. It was about the small, quiet moments. The way Daniel reached for her hand absent-mindedly, as if needing to feel her close even when they weren't speaking. The way he kissed the top of her head every morning before leaving for work. No matter how busy his day would be. The way he looked at her, not as someone he had saved. Not as someone he had transformed. But as someone he had chosen. Again and again. And that was worth more than all the money in the world. Tilda. Their life together wasn't perfect. There were still arguments. Still moments of frustration. Of miscommunication. Of learning. But love wasn't about never fighting. It was about fighting for each other. It was about waking up every day and making the choice to stay. To grow. To believe in something greater than fear. And they did. They built a home filled with warmth. They built a future not defined by their past, but by the choices they made now. They built a family. The day their daughter was born, Daniel cried. Not just a few tears. Not just a quiet, subtle emotion. Real, unguarded, shattering sobs. Because for the first time, he understood something he had never understood before. Money could buy houses, but it couldn't build a home. Power could demand respect, but it couldn't earn love. And for the first time in his life, he had something that no amount of wealth could ever replace. A family. A wife who had forgiven him. Not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. A daughter who would grow up knowing love. Not as a currency, but as a gift. A future where he was no longer the man who had once been ruled by arrogance and control, but the man Evelyn had always deserved. Tilda. Years passed. Their daughter, Grace, grew up surrounded by laughter, by warmth, by stories of resilience and hope. She was fearless, smart, curious about the world, just like her mother, and fiercely loyal, just like her father. One evening, as she sat on Daniel's lap, her tiny fingers tracing the outline of his wedding ring, she looked up at him with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Daddy?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, sweetheart? How did you and Mommy fall in love?" Evelyn, who had been sitting across the room with a book in her lap, let out a quiet laugh. Daniel smirked. "You want the real version or the fairy tale?" Grace pouted. "The real version." Daniel glanced at Evelyn, their eyes meeting, a lifetime of memories passing between them in a single second. Then, he looked back at his daughter. "Well," he said, pulling her closer, "once upon a time, I was a very, very stupid man." Grace giggled. "Really?" "Oh, yes," Evelyn chimed in, setting her book down. "The stupidest." Daniel rolled his eyes playfully before continuing. "And I made a terrible mistake." He met Evelyn's gaze again. "But then I met someone who changed me. Someone who taught me that money means nothing if you don't have someone to share your life with." Grace tilted her head. "Mommy?" Daniel nodded. Grace thought for a moment, then beamed. "So, Mommy made you smarter?" Evelyn burst out laughing. Daniel sighed dramatically. "Something like that." Grace giggled, resting her head against his chest. "Then I'm glad Mommy made you smart," she whispered sleepily. Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his heart full. "Me too," he murmured. Evelyn met his gaze once more, her smile soft, full of something neither of them had words for. Because this was everything, and neither of them would ever take it for granted again. Your past does not define your future. Evelyn went from being invisible to being loved, not because she changed who she was, but because she finally allowed herself to be seen. People can change, but only if they want to. Daniel had been arrogant, careless, and blind to the consequences of his actions. But when he finally chose to be better, he became a man worthy of love. Forgiveness is not weakness. Evelyn didn't forgive Daniel because it was easy. She forgave him because she realized that holding on to anger would only keep her from finding happiness. Love is a choice. Every single day, Evelyn and Daniel chose each other. Through struggles, through mistakes, through healing. Wealth means nothing without love. Money can buy comfort, but it can't buy connection. It can build a house, but it can't make it a home. What do you think? Did Evelyn make the right choice? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in second chances and the power of love, hit like to support Evelyn's journey. Subscribe for more emotional stories, because life isn't perfect, but love always finds a way. Because some love stories start with heartbreak, but the best ones? They end with hope.